everyone, this is Miss Psilos, and today I will be teaching you about food webs and trophic pyramids. This set of notes is set up in outline format, which you're familiar with. Make sure that your numbers and letters are vertically aligned, and also pay attention to how much you've tabbed in. Keep it consistent for each level. If it's in black text, then you're required to write it down. If it's in blue, it's optional to write down. Maybe it's a fun fact, or maybe it's an example. You choose if you want to write it down. Make sure to pause the video when you need to because I will be moving through this quickly. Let's start with the basics. Food webs are all about organisms eating one another. When food is consumed, both matter and energy are transferred between organisms. Ultimately, we can learn how energy moves through an ecosystem by understanding food webs. So let's define both matter and energy. Matter is anything that takes up space and has mass. Essentially, anything that is made of atoms is considered to be matter because it will take up space. There are different states of matter, like solids, liquids, and gases. Each of these types of matter have different densities. Energy is not the same thing as matter. Energy is the ability to do work, and there are many different forms of energy. There's light energy, electrical energy, potential energy, kinetic energy, chemical energy, thermal energy, and nuclear energy. All of these types allow for some work to be accomplished. Take chemical energy. This is the energy that is stored in food. Well, our bodies can convert that energy into kinetic, mechanical energy to produce movement. One form of energy can be converted into other forms of energy. When that transfer happens, some of the energy can be stored, while some of it can be lost to the environment. Keep that in mind as we go. Okay, next topic. Food chains and food webs. What's the difference between the two? A food chain is a linear sequence of organisms in which energy and matter is passed as one eats another. Let's start on the left side here. We have a plant. The beetle eats the plant. I know this because the arrow indicates the direction that the energy is moving. So that means when the beetle consumes the plant, the matter from the plant's body is going into the beetle, and all of the energy stored within the plant will be transferred into the body of the beetle. Then the mouse eats the beetle, and the owl eats the mouse. This is a linear and direct transfer of matter and energy from one organism to the next. A food web shows us more of the story. The food web, or a food web, is an interconnected diagram that shows all eating relationships and all matter and energy transfers in an ecosystem through eating. In reality, organisms don't only consume one thing, they consume a variety of things. To show all the variety of things that organisms eat, we can draw a food web. Same idea applies. We're connecting the organisms with arrows to show the direction that matter and energy are transferring to. But now we're considering all the connections that exist in the entire ecosystem. More biodiverse ecosystems will have more complex food webs. Next topic, and this has to do with food webs. Organisms can play different eating roles in food webs. So let's define each of those roles, starting with producers. This is an organism that is capable of making its own food or producing its own food. There are two main processes that allow organisms to do this. They can make their own food using a process called photosynthesis, where they can take in light energy from the sun, carbon dioxide, and water to produce glucose, which is a food molecule. Or a different way is chemosynthesis. Similar idea, taking chemical and thermal energy and producing their own food with it. Also, photosynthesis can still be done without the sun. It just needs light energy, just to be clear. There are also consumers. These are organisms that cannot make their own food, so they must seek it out. They must eat something from an external source to get the energy they need. And there are different types of consumers. Herbivores are consumers that eat plant material. We could also say it another way: herbivores eat producers. Carnivores are consumers that eat meat or the flesh of other animals. We could say it another way, that carnivores eat herbivores, or maybe they eat omnivores. Top carnivores are those that exist at the top of the food web or the food chain, and they aren't eaten by anything else. They only consume meat since they are top carnivores. Omnivores are consumers that eat both plant and animal material. And here are some examples on the right. This may be new to some of you. Detritivores. These are consumers that eat dead material and they digest that dead material internally. Detritivores mostly eat this stuff called detritus, which is made of leaf litter, and leaf litter is fallen leaves that are now decaying on the forest floor. They eat other decaying material and feces from animals. All of that together makes up detritus. Most common detritivores are insects, worms, and crustaceans. They have digestive systems that help them break this dead stuff down internally. These detritivores are important to food webs as they help recycle nutrients to producers. But they might not always be shown in the food web, but they're definitely around. Now, a side note: scavengers, they're not the same things as detritivores. Scavengers eat recently killed animals and they pick off whatever's left that a carnivore left behind. But the material they're consuming may still have live tissues. Detritivores are eating the stuff that has been dead for a while and is in the process of decaying. Poop doesn't count as live tissues either. Another consumer is a decomposer. Decomposers also eat dead material, but they digest it externally. They produce enzymes, molecules that can digest or break down other substances, and they'll release those enzymes outside of their cells. And so the dead material that they are digesting will be digested externally. Decomposers are usually fungi and bacteria. They're also really important to ecosystems because they too help recycle nutrients back to producers. All right, now that we have the roles down, let's move on to this diagram. It's called a trophic pyramid. A trophic pyramid is a diagram that shows how much energy is distributed in an ecosystem and how that energy is passed from organism to organism. When we're observing food webs, we're only seeing the directional flow of energy in an ecosystem. The trophic pyramid can tell us how much energy is being passed organism to organism through eating. The size of each level in the pyramid shows a visual representation of how much energy exists at that level. So let's start at the bottom. The bottom level of the trophic pyramid is where we find the producers. Remember, producers make their own food, and that means they take in energy from the environment, mainly the sun, and convert that energy into food molecules. They store that energy in their food molecules, and they can store it in their bodies for long periods of time. Producers are simple organisms that don't move or expend a lot of energy, so they actually get to keep most of the energy that they produce. This is why the size of their trophic level is the largest. It's all about how much energy can be stored. One level up from the producer is the primary consumer. Primary consumers are the first consumers, or the organisms that eat the producers, aka herbivores. When primary consumers eat the producers, the energy that was stored in the producer's body is transferred to the body of the primary consumer. However, primary consumers move, digest, poop, and release heat. That means they're losing quite a lot of energy day to day. Therefore, even though they're eating organisms that store a lot of energy in their bodies, primary consumers will lose a lot of the energy they consume. And that's why we see this arrow coming out from that level. Although we do see it a little bit in the producer level, but this arrow, if we have size differences, this arrow would be a little bit smaller. They're losing less energy compared to your primary consumers. And if we compare the size of the trophic level, the primary consumer's trophic level is smaller than that of the producers. So, in fact, on average, primary consumers lose 90% of the energy that they consume from the producers, and that means they're only storing 10% of the energy that they consume, although this percentage can vary. One level up from the primary consumer is the secondary consumer. Secondary consumers are the second consumers or the organisms that eat the primary consumers, aka we would find carnivores or omnivores at this level. Secondary consumers also move around. They maybe even have to chase their food. They digest, they poop, and they release heat day to day. They also lose a lot of the energy that they consume, again, about 90%. So they are only able to store 10% of the energy that they consume because 90% is lost. One more level up, and we hit the tertiary consumers. Not tertiary, tertiary. These are the third consumers, or the organisms that eat the secondary consumers. And again, we would find carnivores and omnivores at this level. In many ecosystems, tertiary consumers will be the highest trophic level because there's just not enough energy that can be supplied to any level higher than this, usually. Remember, as we go up the pyramid, energy is consecutively lost. So by the time we reach the top of the pyramid, there's just not enough energy to be passed or stored to keep those organisms alive. However, in more complex ecosystems or more biodiverse ecosystems, there can be levels higher than tertiary. The next level after tertiary is called quaternary. And quaternary levels are not too common, and it's really not that common to have anything higher than that one. Next topic, the rules for drawing food webs. There are specific rules that must be followed if you ever attempt to draw a food web or a food chain. Rule number one, plants or producers always go at the bottom of the food web or the food chain. Rule number two, the highest trophic levels are shown at the top of the food chain or the food web. If the highest level in the ecosystem is secondary consumer, then we should see those at the top of the food web. Rule number three, the direction of the arrows matters. Arrows always point from the eaten to the eater. Why? Because that's the direction that energy is flowing. The arrow represents the transfer of energy. So when you eat something, the energy from your food is going into your body, or it's being transferred into your body. Practice this. Look at different organisms in this food web and finish the sentence. In this food web, blank eats blank. Pay attention to the direction of the arrows and you can figure this out. Also take note, who are the producers in this food web? Which organisms are at the highest trophic levels? And which trophic levels are they a part of? Is it primary? Is it secondary? Is it tertiary? How can you figure this out? Focus on one food chain. Start at the producer, then go up to the next trophic level, and again until you hit your top. Here's an example. Let's look at the osprey, this one right here. We have to find one food chain that the osprey is part of. To do so, we'll follow the arrows backwards. Osprey eat the large piscivorous fish, and this eats small planktivorous fish, and these eat phytoplankton, which I'm sorry you can't really see at the bottom there. So phytoplankton are the producers since they're at the bottom. The small planktivorous fish are primary consumers. The large piscivorous fish are secondary consumers. So the osprey are tertiary consumers. One other note: some organisms can be part of two different trophic levels. It all depends on the food chain that we're focusing on at any given time. Last topic. This one is called trophic cascades. I'm not going to define it just yet, so just bear with me until I do. As I show you this food web, think about this sentence. If the population of blank crashes, then this is going to happen because of this. So pause the video and try it out. Then let's focus on the antelope. Let's say that the population of the antelope declines for some reason. This will have a consequence on the coyote, which eats the antelope. If the coyote is losing a food source, then its own population may decline. However, we can see that the coyote also eats marmots and beavers too, so it might not decrease too much as it has other food to rely on. There's another consequence to the antelope decline. The grass that the antelope eats now is no longer being consumed as often, so the grass population will increase in size to some extent. From this example, we can see that there are direct effects to changes in food webs. Direct effects happen when changes to one population causes changes to another population that is directly connected to that species. There was a direct effect on the coyote population and the grass population as a result of the antelope population decreasing. Let's keep going. Let's look at the marmot and beaver, and let's imagine that the coyote population does decline as a result of the antelope declining. Well, if there's less coyotes, then marmots and beavers lose a predator, so their populations are likely to increase as a result. If beaver populations increase and they eat willow trees, the willow tree population is likely to decrease because they're going to be eaten more often. Also, as the marmot population increases, so will the bear because the bear will now have more prey to eat. These are examples of indirect effects. Indirect effects happen when changes to one population cause a change to another population that is not directly connected to that species. The starting population that changed was the antelope. As a result of the antelope population changing, the marmot, beaver, willow, and bear populations changed. These are one or more species away from the antelope in the food web, and so the effect on them is indirect. Now for the definition of trophic cascade. A trophic cascade is an indirect change to an ecosystem that is triggered by the addition or removal of a top predator. Now, this is a specific circumstance. A top predator is being removed or added to an ecosystem. This can cause a shakeup of the entire food web. Let's look at a famous example: the Yellowstone wolves. The wolves were eradicated out of the Yellowstone Park because they're predators and they can pose danger to any visitors to the park. However, soon after their removal, the entire ecosystem within the park collapsed. What occurred was the removal of this top predator allowed elk populations to boom out of control. The elk ate away key producers in that ecosystem, causing the collapse of the entire food web. So the wolves served an important purpose to keep the elk populations in check. So when the wolves were removed, indirect changes were triggered, or a trophic cascade was triggered. There are some terms related to trophic cascade events. A foundation species is a species that creates or forms habitats in an ecosystem. They reconstruct environments in ways where new habitats are created. Therefore, they provide structure to the ecosystem. If they're removed, then that structure and all the habitats within are lost. Foundation species are usually producers, but in some cases they aren't. But they are dominant in the ecosystem and provide essential ecosystem services. In the Yellowstone example, the producers that the elk ate away were likely foundation species, and their loss caused the loss of habitats. In the image here, the mollusks that you see that are creating this refuge are foundation species. Other organisms may use this mound of mollusks as breeding ground, as a feeding ground, or maybe just for shelter. The mollusks themselves take up nutrients and store them, and they also filter the water surrounding them, so they improve the water quality. Their presence is extremely important to the survival of this ecosystem. Then there's keystone species. In an archway, a keystone is the top stone that holds the arch together. These, the keystone species, are usually species in higher trophic levels that maintain the biodiversity of an ecosystem. When they're removed, the ecosystem is likely to collapse. Keystone species have top-down control of the ecosystem, maintaining population sizes of the trophic levels below them. The Yellowstone wolves are an example of a keystone species because they controlled the elk population from the top down, since they're a top predator, right? Top down. And their presence stopped the elk population from growing too large. When the wolves were removed, the ecosystem collapsed because that top down control was lost. Last one, indicator species. These are species that indicate the health of the ecosystem because they're sensitive to change. Their presence, absence, or population size can reflect a specific environmental condition. Like, they can tell how much pollution exists, how acidic or basic the environment is, how salty it is, how much oxygen there is, etc. Take a look at this table. We can see that stonefly nymphs are really sensitive to pollutants. If there's a small amount of pollutants in that ecosystem, this population is likely to leave or die off. The freshwater shrimp are a little bit more tolerant to pollutants and can exist when a moderate amount is present. However, when high levels of pollutants exist, the freshwater shrimp are likely to leave or die off, and what remains are the very tolerant species. So the relative amount or presence of each of these indicator species tells us how healthy that ecosystem is. Okay, that's our last slide, and this is the end of our lecture.